In September of 1923, a child was born in Singapore during British colonial rule. The family named him Lee Kuan Yew, meaning light and brightness. This child would one day transform a small trading port into one of the wealthiest nations on Earth. Lee was born into a Peranakan Chinese family, descendants of Chinese immigrants who had adopted aspects of local Malay culture. His parents were English educated, giving young Lee access to quality schooling at Raffles Institution, one of Singapore's most prestigious schools. He excelled academically, standing first in the senior Cambridge examinations. The Japanese occupation from 1942 to 1945 profoundly shaped Lee's worldview. During the brutal Sukching operation, Japanese soldiers rounded up young Chinese men for execution. Lee was ordered onto a truck filled with condemned men, but convinced a soldier to let him collect his belongings first. He never returned to that checkpoint. Every man on that truck was executed. This near-death experience taught Lee crucial lessons about power, vulnerability, and the importance of military strength. After the war, Lee sailed to England to study law at Cambridge University, earning a double first-class honors degree. He married Kwa Geok Chu, a brilliant fellow student who became his lifelong partner. In 1950, they returned to Singapore, where Lee practiced law and represented trade unions, bringing him into contact with the working class and their struggles under colonial rule. In November 1954, Lee co-founded the People's Action Party with English-educated professionals and Chinese-speaking trade unionists. The PAP positioned itself as a democratic socialist party fighting for independence and social justice. In the 1959 general election, the PAP won an overwhelming victory with 43 of 51 seats. On June 5, 1959, Lee Kuan Yew, at age 35, became Singapore's first Prime Minister. The challenges were staggering. Singapore had 1.6 million people, crammed onto a small island with no natural resources. Unemployment stood at 14%. 70% of the population lived in overcrowded slums without proper sanitation. The economy depended entirely on port trade. Education levels were low, with half the population illiterate. Ethnic tensions simmered between Chinese, Malay, and Indian communities. Lee believed Singapore's survival required merger with Malaya to create a larger nation. After intense negotiations, Singapore joined Malaya, Sarawak, and North Borneo on September 16, 1963, to form Malaysia. However, fundamental disagreements emerged immediately. Malaysia's constitution gave special privileges to ethnic Malays. Lee advocated for multiracialism and meritocracy, arguing for a Malaysian Malaysia where all races had equal opportunities. This directly challenged Malay political dominance. Tensions escalated dangerously. In 1964, race riots erupted in Singapore between Malays and Chinese, leaving dozens dead. The Malaysian federal government and Singapore's state government barely communicated. By mid-1965, Malaysian leaders concluded that Singapore must be expelled from the Federation. They feared Lee's advocacy for equal rights would destabilize Malaysia. On August 9, 1965, the Malaysian Parliament voted unanimously to expel Singapore. At 10 in the morning, Singapore became independent. That afternoon, Lee held a televised press conference to announce the separation. Emotion overwhelmed him. His voice cracked, tears filled his eyes, and he had to pause several times. "For me, it is a moment of anguish," Lee said, "because all my life, The whole of my adult life, I have believed in merger and the unity of these two territories. Singapore was suddenly alone. The nation had perhaps 2 battalions of soldiers, no natural resources, no petroleum, no minerals, and not enough land to grow its own food. Singapore imported water from Malaysia. Many observers predicted failure. However, Lee saw this crisis as an opportunity. Singapore would not just survive, but thrive. The island had to become so valuable, so necessary to regional and global commerce that no one would dare threaten it. Lee understood that a government unable to provide basic necessities would never earn loyalty. In 1965, 70% of Singaporeans lived in slums and squatter settlements, families of 6 or 8 crammed into single rooms without running water or sanitation. Fires frequently swept through wooden structures, leaving thousands homeless overnight. In February 1960, Lee's government created the Housing and Development Board with an ambitious mandate: provide decent, affordable housing for all Singaporeans. Lim Kim San became chairman and drove the construction program forward relentlessly. The HDB adopted standardized designs to speed construction and reduce costs. Flats were basic, but represented vast improvements over slum conditions, with running water, proper sanitation, and fire-resistant concrete construction. In May 1961, a massive fire swept through Bukit Ho Swee, destroying thousands of homes and leaving 16,000 people homeless. The government responded immediately, fast-tracking construction of new HDB flats. The Bukit Ho Swee housing estate was completed between 1963 and 1965. The HDB exceeded its initial 5-year target, completing 55,000 flats by 1965. At the peak, new flats were completed every 45 minutes. Entire neighborhoods rose from cleared land in months. However, Lee had a more ambitious goal than rental housing. He wanted to create a nation of homeowners. In 1964, the HDB introduced the Home Ownership for the People scheme, allowing Singaporeans to purchase their flats. The breakthrough came in 1968 when the government allowed Singaporeans to use their Central Provident Fund savings for housing purchases. The CPF was a mandatory savings scheme where employers and employees contributed portions of wages. By allowing CPF funds for down payments and mortgages, home ownership suddenly became accessible to working Singaporeans. The policy worked brilliantly. By 1970, 35% of Singapore's population lived in HDB housing. By 1980, that figure reached 85%. The home ownership rate climbed to 62% by 1984 and eventually exceeded 90%. Singapore transformed from a nation of renters into a nation of property owners. Lee saw public housing as nation building. Home ownership gave Singaporeans a stake in the country's success. People who owned valuable assets would defend those assets and support political stability. The HDB also deliberately mixed ethnic groups in housing estates to promote racial integration. Rather than allowing ethnic enclaves, the government used quotas ensuring each neighborhood reflected Singapore's overall ethnic composition. By the end of the 1960s, HDB estates featured schools, markets, community centers, and playgrounds. The transformation was visible and undeniable. Families who had lived in slums now owned modern apartments in clean, safe neighborhoods. This built enormous political capital for Lee and the PAP, cementing their position as the party that improved people's lives. Long-term prosperity required fundamentally transforming Singapore's economy. In 1965, Singapore's GDP per capita was approximately $500. Unemployment stood at 9%. The economy dangerously depended on entrepot trade, which was declining. The British had announced plans to withdraw their military forces by the early 1970s, eliminating 20% of jobs and significantly reducing GDP. Singapore faced economic crisis unless drastic action was taken. Lee and his economic advisor, Goh Keng Swee, concluded Singapore had to industrialize rapidly by manufacturing goods for export. However, Singapore had no natural resources, no raw materials, and a tiny domestic market of fewer than 2 million people. Traditional development models emphasizing import substitution would not work. Instead, Lee adopted a radical strategy, actively court multinational corporations from developed countries to establish manufacturing operations in Singapore, then export products to global markets. This approach contradicted conventional wisdom of the 1960s. Most developing countries viewed multinationals with suspicion as neo-colonial exploiters. Lee rejected this as impractical ideology. Singapore had no choice but to seek foreign investment because it lacked capital, technology, management expertise, and market access. In August 1961, the government established the Economic Development Board to spearhead industrialization. The EDB promoted foreign investment, provided financing, and developed industrial infrastructure. To attract investors, Singapore offered generous tax holidays, built industrial estates with ready infrastructure, streamlined bureaucratic procedures, and most importantly, provided political stability, rule of law, and zero tolerance for corruption. The strategy worked. American companies arrived first. Texas Instruments opened a semiconductor plant in 1968. National Semiconductor followed. Hewlett-Packard established manufacturing operations. Japanese companies invested heavily, with electronics firms building factories. European companies arrived as well. By 1972, 1/4 of Singapore's manufacturing firms were foreign-owned or joint ventures. The impact was dramatic. From 1965 to 1973, the economy grew at an average annual rate of 12.7%, one of the highest growth rates in the world. Manufacturing's share of GDP climbed from 14% in 1965 to 22% by 1975, creating thousands of jobs. Unemployment fell from 14% in 1965 to virtually zero by the mid-1970s. The government continuously refined its strategy. In the 1960s, Singapore focused on labor-intensive manufacturing like textiles and simple electronics assembly. By the mid-1970s, with full employment achieved and wages rising, the economy needed to move toward capital-intensive and skill-intensive industries. The government encouraged investment in higher-value electronics, petrochemicals, precision engineering, and aerospace components. Singapore developed as a financial services center parallel to manufacturing. In 1968, Singapore established the Asian dollar market, allowing banks to accept deposits and make loans in foreign currencies without restrictions. This attracted international banks, transforming Singapore into a regional financial hub. The government progressively liberalized the financial sector, and major banks established regional headquarters in Singapore. The government invested heavily in infrastructure. Changi Airport opened in 1981, providing world-class connectivity. The Port of Singapore expanded continuously. Roads, highways, and public transportation linked industrial estates with residential areas. Telecommunications infrastructure was modernized. Education policy was tightly integrated with economic strategy. The government established technical schools and polytechnics to produce workers with needed skills. The National University of Singapore and Nanyang Technological University produced engineers, scientists, and business graduates. The Skills Development Fund financed continuous worker training, ensuring the workforce could adapt to technological change. The results were extraordinary. By 1990, when Lee stepped down as Prime Minister, Singapore's GDP per capita had risen to approximately $13,000, surpassing South Korea, Israel, and Portugal. By 2015, it had reached $56,000, catching up with Germany and the United States. Singapore had joined the ranks of the world's wealthiest countries without natural resources, relying entirely on its people, strategic location, and institutional quality. Independence brought existential security concerns. In August 1965, Singapore had only 2 infantry battalions, perhaps 1,000 soldiers total. The country had no air force, no navy, and no indigenous arms industry. Yet Singapore faced potential threats from much larger neighbors. Indonesia had recently ended its konfrontasi policy, but remained unpredictable. Malaysia controlled Singapore's water supply. Lee appointed Goh Keng Swee as Minister for Interior and Defense, handing him the enormous responsibility of building a credible military force from scratch. Goh approached several countries seeking military advisors, but most declined. The breakthrough came from Israel. Israeli military advisors arrived in Singapore beginning in 1965, operating discreetly to avoid antagonizing Muslim neighbors. They helped design Singapore's military organization, trained officers, and advised on doctrine. On March 14, 1967, Parliament passed the National Service Amendment Bill, introducing compulsory military conscription for all male citizens aged 18. This required every young man to give 2 years to military training, followed by annual reservist obligations. The policy affected families across Singapore and fundamentally changed growing up Singaporean. National service served 2 purposes. It provided manpower for a credible military force. Beyond defense, it contributed to nation building by bringing together young men from different ethnic backgrounds, social classes, and educational levels to serve a common purpose. Shared hardship would forge Singaporean identity and create bonds across communal divisions. The first national serviceman enlisted in August 1967. Training facilities were basic and equipment limited. Israeli advisors provided crucial expertise, helping develop training programs and establish the Singapore Armed Forces Training Institute at Pasir Laba. By 1971, just 6 years after independence, Singapore had 17 national service battalions, totaling 16,000 active soldiers with 11,000 reserves. From virtually no military capacity, Singapore had built a substantial force. In 1967, Lee joined the Association of Southeast Asian Nations with Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand. ASEAN promoted cooperation and stability among Southeast Asian nations. In 1971, Singapore signed the 5-Power Defence Arrangements with Australia, Britain, Malaysia, and New Zealand, providing consultation mechanisms and joint military exercises. Singapore also negotiated with Taiwan to conduct military exercises there, providing territory for armor and artillery training impossible on the small island. The government invested in developing Singapore's defense industry and technological capabilities, establishing the Defense Science Organization for electronic warfare and cryptography. National service became deeply embedded in Singaporean society. By 2015, over 1 million men had completed their service. The shared experience created bonds transcending ethnic and class divisions. However, national service imposed costs. 2 years of compulsory service meant young men entered the workforce later. Annual reservist obligations disrupted careers and family life. Nevertheless, successive governments maintained national service as fundamental to Singapore's defense and national identity. Lee understood that economic development and military security would mean nothing if the government was corrupt, incompetent, or lacked legitimacy. Building effective institutions became as important as building factories or armies. Corruption had been endemic during the colonial period. Police officers routinely demanded bribes. Government officials traded favors for money. This undermined public trust, discouraged business, and created unfair advantages. Lee adopted a zero-tolerance approach, seeing corruption not just as moral failing, but as practical threat to development. In June 1960, Lee's government passed the Prevention of Corruption Act, giving the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau substantially enhanced powers. The CPIB could arrest suspects without warrants, search premises, seize documents, access bank accounts, and compel testimony. Most importantly, the CPIB reported directly to the Prime Minister, ensuring independence from other agencies. Lee ensured the CPIB investigated corruption impartially, without regard to position or political affiliation. Between 1966 and 2016, the CPIB investigated 5 PAP leaders for corruption. The most senior was Tay Chiang Wan, Minister for National Development, investigated in 1986 for accepting $1 million in bribes. Before he could be charged, Tay committed suicide, leaving a note apologizing to Lee. The government recognized enforcement alone would not eliminate corruption. In 1972, Lee introduced competitive salaries for ministers and senior civil servants. The logic was straightforward. If officials were paid significantly less than private sector equivalents, they would face constant temptation to be corrupt or leave for better jobs. By paying competitive wages, the government reduced both corruption incentive and talent drain. This policy proved controversial. Critics argued ministers' salaries in Singapore became among the highest globally. Lee defended it as pragmatic. Singapore needed the best and brightest in government, and those individuals had lucrative private alternatives. The strategy succeeded. Singapore consistently ranked among the least corrupt countries worldwide in international surveys. Beyond combating corruption, Lee built meritocracy throughout government and society. Positions, promotions, and rewards were awarded based on ability and performance, rather than connections, ethnicity, or family background. This principle shaped education policy fundamentally. Singapore established a highly competitive education system that rigorously tested students and streamed them based on academic performance. Students who excelled were fast-tracked into elite schools and universities. Scholarships were awarded based on examination results rather than family wealth. Education reform was central to Singapore's development strategy. In 1959, approximately half of Singapore's population was illiterate. Lee's government made education universal and compulsory. All children were required to attend primary school with free education through secondary school. The government invested heavily in building schools, training teachers, and developing curriculum. Singapore adopted a bilingual education policy that became one of Lee's signature achievements. The policy required all students to learn English plus their designated mother tongue. Mandarin Chinese for ethnic Chinese students, Malay for Malay students, and Tamil for Indian students. English was established as the medium of instruction for all content subjects. This policy served multiple purposes. English provided a common language, uniting Singapore's diverse ethnic communities and connecting Singapore to the global economy, science, and technology. Mother tongue education preserved cultural identity and traditional values. Implementing bilingual education proved challenging. Many Chinese students spoke dialects like Hokkien or Cantonese at home, but had to learn Mandarin as their mother tongue while mastering English. To support this, Lee launched the Speak Mandarin campaign in 1979, encouraging Chinese Singaporeans to speak Mandarin rather than dialects. Despite challenges, the bilingual education system produced results. By the 1990s, Singapore had achieved near-universal literacy. Singaporean students consistently ranked at or near the top in international assessments. The education system became recognized globally as one of the most effective, producing students with strong foundations in mathematics, science, and languages. The meritocratic education system created real pathways for upward social mobility. Children from poor families could, through academic excellence, gain admission to top schools, win scholarships, and rise to positions of influence. However, the intense competition also created problems. Students faced enormous pressure to excel. The streaming system, sorting students based on examination performance as early as primary school, created anxiety. Those failing to reach elite schools often felt stigmatized. By the 1980s, the transformation of Singapore was undeniable. Visitors arriving at the gleaming Changi Airport were struck by the cleanliness, efficiency, and modernity. The skyline had changed dramatically, with high-rise buildings replacing low-rise shophouses and kampongs. Roads were smooth, public transportation was efficient, crime rates were low. The economic statistics told a remarkable story. In 1965, Singapore's nominal GDP was approximately 974 million Singapore dollars. By 1990, when Lee stepped down, GDP had grown to $66.2 billion, a 68-fold increase. Adjusting for inflation and population growth, real per capita income had increased more than sevenfold over 25 years. Singapore had achieved one of the highest sustained economic growth rates in human history. The economy's composition had changed fundamentally. Manufacturing employed hundreds of thousands in sophisticated industries like electronics, petrochemicals, and precision engineering. Financial services had grown to become a major pillar. Tourism brought millions of visitors annually. The port remained one of the busiest globally. Unemployment, which had been 14% in 1965, had been eliminated. By the late 1980s, Singapore faced labor shortages rather than unemployment. Living standards had risen dramatically. In 1965, many families lived in one-room slums. By 1990, more than 85% of Singaporeans lived in modern HDB flats, and the majority owned their homes. Household incomes had increased substantially, allowing families to purchase consumer goods that would have been unaffordable luxuries a generation earlier. Health outcomes improved remarkably. Life expectancy at birth increased from about 65 years in 1965 to 75 years by 1990. Infant mortality fell from 26 deaths per 1,000 live births in 1965 to 6.6 per 1,000 by 1990, approaching developed country levels. Education levels rose dramatically. Universal primary education was achieved by the 1970s. Secondary school enrollment climbed steadily. Crime rates fell as economic opportunities expanded and police became more professional. Singapore developed a reputation as one of the safest cities globally. Environmental quality improved despite rapid industrialization. Lee was personally committed to making Singapore a green city, launching tree planting campaigns and insisting industrial development include environmental safeguards. Singapore earned the nickname Garden City. By 1990, Singapore had clearly graduated from developing country status. International organizations classified Singapore as a newly industrialized economy, alongside South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, the four Asian tigers. Singapore's GDP per capita exceeded some European countries. The transformation from third world to first world had been accomplished in just 25 years. Lee captured this transformation in his memoir published in 2000, titled From Third World to First, The Singapore Story, 1965 to 2000. The title reflected his pride in what Singapore had achieved under his leadership. He had taken a small, poor island with no natural resources and built it into a prosperous, modern nation commanding international respect. However, this success came with costs critics were quick to point out. Lee's governance style was authoritarian, brooking little opposition. Political opponents were sued for defamation, bankrupted, and driven from politics. The Internal Security Act allowed detention without trial. Freedom of speech and press were tightly controlled. Newspapers could have licenses revoked for content the government deemed harmful. Elections were held regularly, but the political playing field was not level. The PAP enjoyed enormous advantages, including media control and ability to redraw electoral boundaries. Opposition parties struggled to compete against the well-funded PAP machine. Lee defended these practices as necessary pragmatism. He argued Singapore's survival required strong, effective government that could act decisively without being paralyzed by fractious politics. International human rights organizations criticized Singapore's restrictions on civil liberties. Lee and other leaders responded defiantly, arguing Western countries had no right to impose their values on Asian societies. The Asian values debate emerged, with Lee arguing that Asian societies placed greater emphasis on community order and collective welfare than on individual rights. Critics responded this was self-serving justification for authoritarianism. Despite controversies, Lee's achievements were undeniable. He had transformed Singapore from a poor, vulnerable city-state into one of the wealthiest and most advanced nations in the world. Under his leadership, Singapore achieved political stability, economic prosperity, social harmony among diverse ethnic groups, world-class infrastructure, excellent education and healthcare systems, and a reputation for efficiency and good governance. Lee's influence extended beyond Singapore's borders. He became an elder statesman whose views were sought by world leaders. Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping visited Singapore in 1978 and was deeply impressed. Deng saw Singapore as a model for what China could become, and many of China's subsequent reform policies were influenced by the Singapore example. In November 1990, after 31 years as Prime Minister, Lee stepped down, handing power to Goh Chok Tong. Lee was 67 and believed in succession planning. He remained in cabinet as senior minister, continuing to influence policy. In 2004, when his elder son, Lee Hsien Loong, became prime minister, Lee took the title Minister Mentor, remaining in cabinet until 2011, when at age 87, he finally retired completely. Lee Kuan Yew's wife, Kwa Geok Chu, passed away on October 2, 2010, after suffering strokes. Her death devastated Lee, who had relied on her counsel for over 60 years. In his later years, Lee became more reflective, writing memoirs and giving interviews looking back on his life's work. On March 23, 2015, Lee Kuan Yew died at Singapore General Hospital at age 91, following weeks of hospitalization for severe pneumonia. His death marked the end of an era. The outpouring of grief was extraordinary. Over 450,000 Singaporeans lined up for hours to pay respects at Parliament House. The state funeral on March 29, 2015, was attended by dignitaries from around the world, representing the respect Lee had earned internationally. Lee's legacy is complex and multifaceted. He achieved something extraordinary, taking a small, resource-poor island with no history as an independent nation and diverse population with no shared identity, facing enormous challenges and building it into one of the most successful countries in the world. This achievement required vision, determination, political skill, ruthlessness, and unwavering focus on long-term goals. The Singapore that Lee built was orderly, prosperous, efficient, and safe. Citizens enjoyed high incomes, excellent public services, quality education and healthcare, modern housing, and political stability. Singaporeans could walk streets safely at night, drink tap water, rely on public transportation, and trust the government would deliver competent administration. In the context of Southeast Asia in the 1960s and 1970s, where many countries experienced military coups, civil wars, hyperinflation, and failed development, Singapore's success was remarkable. Lee's economic policies proved extraordinarily successful. His strategy of attracting foreign investment, building export-oriented industries, investing in education and infrastructure, and maintaining political stability created sustained high growth that lifted millions from poverty. His emphasis on meritocracy opened opportunities for talented individuals regardless of background. His anti-corruption policies made Singapore one of the cleanest governments worldwide. His investment in public housing gave Singaporeans stakes in their country and built political stability. However, Lee's legacy also includes authoritarian governance, restricted civil liberties, and political culture, discouraging dissent and independent thinking. Political opposition was crushed systematically. Critics were sued into bankruptcy or detention. Media was controlled. Civil society remained weak. The debate over Lee Kuan Yew's legacy ultimately reflects different values and priorities. Those prioritizing economic development, social order, and collective welfare view Lee positively, seeing a pragmatic leader who delivered results. Those prioritizing individual freedom, political pluralism, and human rights view Lee more critically, seeing an authoritarian who unnecessarily restricted freedoms. What is undeniable is that Lee Kuan Yew was one of the most consequential political leaders of the 20th century. He fundamentally transformed his country and influenced development thinking globally. His life demonstrates what determined, intelligent leadership can accomplish, for better and worse. The city-state he built stands as testament to human capacity for organization, planning, and achievement. Singapore today continues to prosper long after Lee's passing. The institutions he built, the values he instilled, and the systems he established have proven durable. The country faces new challenges in the 21st century, including aging demographics, economic disruption from technology, political pressures from a more educated population, and geopolitical tensions. Whether Singapore can continue thriving while addressing these challenges remains to be seen. Lee himself had no illusions about permanence. He often said, Singapore's success was not inevitable and could be lost if future generations became complacent. He worried whether Singaporeans would maintain the discipline, hard work, and collective spirit that made success possible, or whether prosperity would breed softness and entitlement. When asked about his greatest achievement, Lee would often point not to economic statistics or gleaming buildings, but to the transformation of people's lives. He had given millions of Singaporeans opportunities for better lives than their parents could have imagined. Children who might have grown up in slums, illiterate, and impoverished, instead received education, lived in decent homes, and joined the middle class. The story of Lee Kuan Yew and Singapore's transformation is ultimately a story about possibilities of human organization and effort. It demonstrates that geography is not destiny, that resource poverty need not mean economic poverty, and that intelligent policy implemented consistently over decades can produce remarkable results. It shows that strong institutions, good governance, and investment in human capital can overcome enormous obstacles. At the same time, the story raises uncomfortable questions about trade-offs between freedom and prosperity, between individual rights and collective welfare, between democratic accountability and technocratic efficiency. These questions have no easy answers, and different societies will answer them differently based on their own histories, values, and circumstances. From the tearful announcement of separation in August 1965 to the gleaming modern metropolis of today, Singapore's journey has been extraordinary. At the center of that journey stood Lee Kuan Yew, the man who more than any other shaped his nation's destiny. His life reminds us that individuals can matter, that leadership can make a difference, and that small countries need not accept their fate as pawns of larger powers. As night falls over Singapore, the city sparkles with lights from thousands of high-rise buildings. Ships from around the world crowd the harbor. Changi Airport handles flights to destinations across the globe. Marina Bay Sands dominates the skyline. The Singapore Flyer rotates slowly, giving riders panoramic views of one of the world's most successful cities. This is the Singapore that Lee Kuan Yew built, transformed from a poor, vulnerable city-state that many predicted would fail into a thriving, prosperous nation serving as a model of development. The journey from poverty to wealth, from vulnerability to security, from disorder to order, took decades of sustained effort, clear vision, ruthless execution, and unwavering determination. Lee Kuan Yew's story is Singapore's story, and Singapore's story is a remarkable chapter in human history. It shows what is possible when vision meets opportunity, when leadership meets challenge, and when a people unite in common purpose. Whatever judgments history may render on Lee's methods and legacy, his achievement in transforming Singapore from third world to first world in a single generation stands as one of the great accomplishments of modern statecraft. The light that was born on Kampong Java Road in September 1923 burned brightly for 91 years, illuminating a path forward for his nation and leaving an imprint on world history that will endure long after the memory of the man himself fades into time.